has something he wants to say to you. How many of you have ever been stuck before? Show me your hands. You've been stuck before. Turn to your neighbor and tell them how you were stuck. Just really briefly. You can't tell the whole story, but how have you been stuck?
I actually got stuck on a heart. Big old.
Here's what I encourage you to do, because behind every stuck, there's a story, right? Behind every stuck, there's a story, and your story matters. And after the service, I just challenge you to tell the person, finish the story, because they're good. But since I'm up here and I have a microphone, I can tell my stuck story. I remember I was driving back to college. It was winter break. I grew up north in Illinois, and I was driving down I-74, and it started snowing and snowing and snowing, and it was hard to see, and so I was driving really, really slowly, and I hit this patch of black ice. And so if you're not from up north and you don't know what black ice is, it's ice on black pavement, and you don't see it, and you just hit it, and I ended up in a ditch. I ended up in a really deep ditch full of snow. And so I did something that you do to get unstuck. And I don't know if you've ever been stuck and tried this, but you kind of try to put it in drive and go forward, and then put it in reverse and go backwards, and you try to work yourself out of being stuck. And so what I really did is just get myself more stuck. And if you've ever been stuck, you know the sound of tires when you're stuck. There's this sound that it makes, right? But you're stuck. There's nothing you can do. And I remember being in this car and thinking, first, I'm going to die in a snowdrift, right? But I finally, this is important. Some of you cannot relate. There was no such thing as a cell phone back then. Yes, I know that just dated me as old, but the reality is there were no cell phones. And so I remember trying to climb out of my car and pray that nobody else slides and hits the same patch I did and smashes me. But I got out, and I remember a snow truck was coming through, and I waved it down, and they called a tow truck for me to get me unstuck. Now, you can get stuck in all sorts of ways. That's a story of getting stuck kind of physically. I remember being stuck as a sixth grader who hated school, hated academics. And I remember thinking, I just want to get done with all of this. I hate school. And I was stuck. And a teacher came and helped me to get unstuck. Some of you have been stuck before. You've been stuck athletically. You had a goal, you had a dream, and an injury or something came along, and you found yourself plateaued, stuck where you were, and you wanted to achieve more, but you were stuck. Some of you have been stuck relationally before. That's called marriage. Right? No, that's a total joke. That's a total joke. Marriage is God's plan. It's awesome. It's wonderful. But many of us have found ourselves in relationships stuck. We know that there's potential, but we're stuck, and we want so much more. And so here's the question. How do you get unstuck? How do you get unstuck? I want to show you a video here that I think, first of all, is funny. I'll say that. So check out this video.
Oh, that's not good.
Eat this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator, and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? Help! I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's nothing else left to do. That's it.
Is that funny? Did you get it? I think that's important to ask. Now, here's the deal. The funny part of that is what? They could have just taken the next step and they wouldn't be stuck. There are times in life we're stuck, and the reality is all that we have to do is take the next step. But what we do instead is we feel like, emotionally, we're stuck, and so we start crying out in all sorts of different ways. Help! Help! And sometimes when we're stuck, really the only thing we need to do is take the next step. Some of you here, you're stuck, and what you really need to do is the next step. You don't need to cry out. What you need to realize, instead of crying out, hoping that a voice will answer, is to recognize God has already spoken. There are things that He's already told you that some of you probably very innately know to be true. And your challenge is to listen to what you already know and take the next step. Now, there's also a different picture I can paint for you, and it's this. Imagine many of you have been on a treadmill, right? Raise your hand if you've been on a treadmill. You've been on that like painful exercise machine that you run, but you go nowhere, right? You know what I mean? It's like, to me, there is no slower death than a treadmill. It's like you get on it and you go nowhere. The speed can increase, but you don't go anywhere different. And that's the picture of being stuck. And some of you have found yourself on a treadmill. You have found yourself doing the same thing over and over and over, and you're hoping that you'll get unstuck by doing the same thing. I remember being a high school athlete, and I like to say this: I was a big fish in a small pond. I thought I was a great basketball player because I grew up in a really small place, and frankly, it didn't take a lot to be better than the next guy. I remember being stuck, though. And I remember when I got to college thinking, I'm going to do okay, and then realizing everybody around me was better. And I realized that I had been stuck in the same place for a long time. And that didn't feel too good. Some of you are going to go through those emotions. Some of you are in that place occupationally. You want a breakthrough, but you've been doing the same thing. Some of you want that spiritually. You know that God can do more in your life, but you've been doing the same thing over and over, and you feel stuck. Stuck on a treadmill, going through the motions, but getting nowhere. Kind of like the tires going, zzz, right? So what do you do when you're stuck? When you're stuck physically, when you're stuck emotionally, spiritually, relationally, occupationally, how do you get unstuck? If you have your copy of Scripture, open up to Matthew chapter 6. Jesus tells a story. He gives us a picture. While you're turning there, let me tell you one more story. I read a story this week of a man who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He had been married to his wife for about 2 years. Their dream was to get married and to have a family. They decided, like many do these days, to plan when they were going to have a baby. They got to that point and they started doing all the things you have to do to have a baby, right? And so they had been going through these motions for a year and no baby. And then a year and a half and no baby. And they started getting really consumed with worried, scared that something was wrong with them physically. They went to the doctor. The wife got tested first. Nothing was wrong. The husband went to the doctor, got tested. Nothing wrong. They're not having a baby, but everything physically, biologically works. The doctor told them a really challenging thing to us in our world, our culture today. He said, here's the deal. I think you need to slow down. I think you need to work on the level of stress in your life, because stress is a powerful force. But they were stuck in the rut, the routine of all they had to do. Now, the husband loved fantasy football. Anybody in here like fantasy football? Yes, there's 3 of us, right? And so the deal is, some of you just play football, so you don't have the time for that yet. This dude, he loved fantasy football, and so he had like 50 I'm making that up. He had several fantasy football leagues that he was a part of. And he started feeling, as he was praying, God saying, you love this, but you love your wife more, right? You love this, but you want a baby more, right? And so after a little bit of thinking, he determined, I really do love my wife, and we really do want a baby more than I care about fantasy football. And so he made a decision. He made a decision that he was going to not be involved in fantasy football that year. And instead, he had been reading a book called The Circle Maker by Mark Batterson, and he started walking around their house praying for his wife. And as he was praying for his wife, and he walked around the house for 7 days in a row, he started, not 7 like full days in a row, one time a day for 7 days, he walked around the house. And he wasn't praying that like the house would fall down, if you know the story of Joshua and Jericho. Instead, he was praying that the obstacles would fall down in their life, and that he would be able to love and support his wife in a way that the stress would be relieved and they would be able to have a baby. And so as he was praying instead of playing fantasy football, he started thinking of other ways that he could relieve the workload and the stress of his wife, and so he did it. And she got pregnant. Now, here's the deal. Anytime you want something greater, you have to give something up you really like. Football players, other athletes in the room, you know this. This is part of our lifestyle. When you want to be a champion, when you want to win, you give up idleness and laziness. You give up the game system to work out. You train hard. We know this, that in every area of life, if you want to lose weight, you got to give up chocolate chip cookies, right? We know this. If we want to have a relationship, we have to give up all of our personal busyness to invest time in another person. If you want to succeed academically, it means you have to give up things you really like and spend time studying. The things that you did before aren't good enough for college, and so you'll have to give up things you really love to achieve and exceed academically. You want a better marriage, a better relationship? There are things that you have to give up so that you can have what you want. This man who gave up fantasy football for his family learned this. Any time that we want to get unstuck, we have to trade what we love, what we want, for what we want and what we love more. See, this is the very principle that Jesus teaches about fasting in Matthew chapter 6. He teaches this about fasting. Now, I'm going to define fasting for you. It's this: giving up something you like for something you want more. Anytime in life that we want to achieve more, we have to sacrifice. If we want to move from intention to action, then there are things that we have to give up to become unstuck. Sometimes we feel stuck because we just aren't willing to give anything up. And Jesus teaches this about fasting. A biblical fast is refraining from something, namely food, for something I want more. Now, this can go into many different areas. Some of you are athletes, and quite frankly, you can't give up food now because you're training, and you really need that nutrition. You need that fuel. But the rest of us, we could probably give up a little bit of food because we're not burning all that much energy. But athletes, maybe you'll give up an hour playing games. Maybe you'll give up an hour on social media. Maybe you'll give up an hour of those things that have been distracting you to focus on what God wants for you more. This is what I believe. There's a reason Jesus uses food as the picture of what fasting is. Because we all eat food. Now, take a second. Turn to somebody near you to wake up for a minute and tell them your very favorite food. Okay, go. Okay, so next question, and this is for everybody. It's just a random poll. How many of you had a difficult time saying what your favorite food is because you love so many foods? Right? That's me. I love food. As a matter of fact, our culture is obsessed with, quite frankly, worships food. Have you ever noticed this? How many of you have been going on a trip, or you have been going, let's say, moving to a new town, and the first thing you did is look up what food the destination has? Raise your hand if that's you. I don't know about you, but my wife and I have many times prayed about God's will, and God's will, His answer is through what food belongs in a certain place, right? We have a certain theory that if Starbucks is not in the town, God's presence isn't there. And so, thank God for Warner University and a Starbucks next door. Some people have no idea what I'm talking about. It's all good, because that saves more coffee for me. But, with that being said, our cultures worship food, and in America, in our lives, even when we are deprived of a little bit of food, there is more food available here than anywhere else in the world, and there are people literally starving around the world. But we worship food. We do. Even when we feel like we're hungry, the truth is, food is not that far away from us. Now, I think Jesus talks about food because it's something we all long for, crave for, and need. And He wants to teach us something really important. That in all of our craving in life, our hankering for a chocolate chip cookie, or our hankering for Chick-fil-A, our desire to have a wonderful brownie, or whatever it might be, He wants us to recognize we need God more than our craving for that food. Now, I don't know how many folks are here who don't necessarily believe in God and aren't necessarily striving with all of the actions and the thoughts of their life to follow after God. But I know this, you need food. And I know this, you get stuck. I know that there are times that you get paralyzed with the zzz, I can't go anywhere. I would like to be better than I am, but I'm stuck. And for that moment, God gives this tool to learn how to be unstuck. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says this. He says, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your face and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. First, I want to say this. Jesus teaches that there is reward for people who will break the cycle of being stuck and fast. To give something up to get something better. Principle number one I want to show you. If you are a Christ follower here today, this is the moment you should zone in. This is the moment you should listen. Now, if you aren't, I want to say with all respect, this might not apply to you, and that's okay. But if you really want to pursue Jesus, here's the deal. You got to listen. Jesus doesn't say, if you want to fast. He doesn't say, someday you might fast. He says, when you fast. First thing you need to understand is if you are a follower of Jesus, there is a call to discipline to fast. You wonder why God isn't moving in your life, why you aren't experiencing the power of God in fresh new ways. You feel like you're stuck spiritually. Let me tell you, you need to fast because Jesus tells his followers when you fast, you're going to see the reward from heaven. This is the deal. It's not an option. We're all called to fast. I think one of the reasons we don't like the church, now I'm talking to all of us, is we don't see God's power. And you want to know why I believe we don't see God's power? God moving you forward? Why it's so stinking hard for you to follow Jesus? Because we aren't willing to be disciplined in this area of our life. Jesus says, when you fast, try me out. See that I don't reward you. I would challenge you all, number one, that fasting is a biblical truth for all Christ followers. Second, fasting is refraining from food and multiplying it with prayer. It's to say, I'm not going to eat right now so that I can pray. Now, why in the world would God have this principle that started way back in old times, like Moses fasted and prayed? The prophets fasted and prayed. Jesus and his disciples fasted and prayed. The early church fasted and prayed. Paul fasted and prayed. Paul taught the churches he planted to fast. Why was this idea of fasting so important? Because when you get hungry, there is this thing that turns on inside of you that you crave. There's this rumbling that says, feed me. And fasting is a tool that when that arises inside of us, we're to say, you know what? Jesus reminded Christ followers that we don't exist by food alone. That we have something greater, something more powerful. It's the very Word of God. It's having the presence of God in our life. And so I would challenge you, if you feel stuck in your marriage, fast for it. Fast that God's power would show up. If you feel stuck in your job and you hate it, fast and see what God says. If you think, I can't do this thing academically, I know I have the skills to play the sport, but academically I don't know, fast and see if God doesn't teach you the principles you need to excel and exceed your wildest dreams. See, fasting is this powerful tool, and when that craving comes up, Jesus teaches us, when that craving comes, pray. Turn to God in that moment. You'll learn your need for Him in the midst of this craving for something else. I'm going to substitute something really quickly. There's a lot of testosterone in the room. Can I get an amen? Right? And I would suggest this, guys, you listening? Because I know you, I'm a guy. When you get other longings and cravings, stop them and substitute prayer. Stop them and substitute prayer. Ladies, you too, let's be honest. We blame dudes all the time, but I've heard some of you talk. I've heard your chatter. Here's the deal. When cravings take over, we're taught, stop and pray. Remember that our body doesn't need food alone. It doesn't have a single drive. It's turn those things and allow it to be a tool to get you unstuck, because some of you are stuck in places that you just need to stop and say, God, here I am. I need you to show up. The third thing is this. Fasting adds focus and intensity to our prayer life. There's different kinds of fasting. Did you know that? So I'm going to get real practical for a second. I'm talking about food, and I'm going to show you in a minute why Jesus talks about food. But you can fast food, but you can also fast TV, social media, video games. You can fast dating relationships, because when you're dating, it takes lots of time, or at least it should, or you're not doing it right. Okay? But with that being said, you can fast food, chocolate, candy. You can fast one time a day. A traditional fast is from sun up to sundown. You can fast for 40 days. You can fast for 21 days, like Daniel did. You can fast one meal. You can fast 2 meals. There aren't any real rules to this thing other than you've got to change to a focused intensity to pursue the things of God. The last thing I want to say about that is giving up. Fasting is giving up something I want for something I want more. Did you know that fasting is for a spiritual purpose? One more practical thing. What do you call a fast without prayer? A diet. Thank you. Yes. A fast without prayer is simply a diet. I know some folks, when they start fasting, they're like, hey, it's like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I get to diet and lose some weight and have some extra time to pray. I would just suggest that you're probably missing the point if that's what you're thinking. Maybe instead of fasting foods, you should fast something else, so that the intention is fully upon God, not upon yourself. As a matter of fact, I think that's one of the things that we learn from fasting. Jesus, speaking to a bunch of really religious people, he says that when they fast, they're trying to show off. They're trying to be showy about their faith and what they do. And he says, don't do that. Don't do that. He's saying to them, do you know what you learn when you start to fast, when you fast like that? That what you really need is to be less selfish. Your point is all about you, and that's the problem. So change your focus. All right. I believe this, that traction, you remember the wheels, the point of getting out is traction. When that tow truck came to get me, when my car had slid off into the ditch full of snow, they hooked up these cables to the front of my car, and then they put these like little pads near the wheels. The pads' intention were, as they started to pull me forward, that I could get some traction to move. Fasting gives us traction, and traction comes from a focused intensity. Fasting unlocks a deeper dimension of spiritual power that breaks the cycle we're in. Now, pay attention. I want to walk you through the cycle of being stuck. I want to show you how you become stuck, and I want to show you how to get unstuck. Are you ready? So it starts with this. You find yourself stuck in some particular area, and you move from stuck to stressed. You move from stuck to stressed. And then you start thinking, how did I get stuck? How am I here? Why am I here? And you find yourself then just spinning your wheels. Somebody who's really, really good with language. What is what is stress spelled backwards? Dessert, right? Stress spelled backwards. And how many of you can just say, yep, that's me. When I get stressed, I turn to food. I turn to dessert. I can promise you, you know when I'm stressed. My wife can vouch for this. I eat chocolate chip cookies, brownies. My favorite is chocolate chip cookies. If you see me with a handful of chocolate chip cookies, you can just walk up. I give you permission. So what are you so stressed about? You remember when you were telling us about this whole thing? What are you so stressed about? And we'll talk about it. There's something that happens when we're stressed, and there's actually a reason that we turn to food. When we eat food, it releases these neurotransmitters in our brain, right? There is, and you can go to Mr. Regal's class later this year, and you can really learn the reasons behind this, but here's the deal. When you eat, it actually makes you feel better for a period of time because all of these chemicals are released in your brain, and you start feeling better. How many of you have ever eaten Chinese food? Can I get an amen? Amen? Like, good Chinese food is wonderful, but what's the bad thing about Chinese food? Yeah, there's also... How many of you have had the most wonderful Chinese food, and then like 2 hours later you're like, I'm starving! Why am I so hungry, right? There's something that happens. Food makes us feel better for a moment of time. For a moment, it makes us feel stressed. Not like de-stressed, but like unstressed. But after its effects wear off, guess where you still are? Stuck. And you're in this cycle of zzz, right? How many of you want to break out of that place? This is what I believe is that God gives us the ability to move through this. Watch the second part of the video we started earlier.
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second. He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
So that is a picture of what food is like when we're in this toxic cycle of being stuck. Food is like, oh, help is on the way. And then it jumps on the escalator, and their escalator stops. Now, if you really want to beat the cycle of stuck, you have to replace food with fasting. When you begin to break this cycle, fasting and depending on God, turning to God, asking God to step into the situation, He turns this whole process into focused intensity. Now, coaches, let me ask you a question. How many of you would love your players to have focused intensity? Yeah, at least a couple coaches, yeah. How many of you captains on the football team would like the rest of your team to have focused intensity? How many of you parents would like your children to have focused intensity? How many of you employers would love your employees to have focused intensity? See, this spiritual principle has such bigger benefits than just the idea of, hey, if I fast, I can pray a little bit more. There, as Jesus said, is a reward for it. So, stuck to stress, to I'm going to fast. And I'm going to ask God to intervene. I'm going to ask God to be the tow truck, the rescue truck that shows up, gives me new traction, pulls me out of the rut I'm in, and gives me a focused intensity. Because when we have focused intensity, we can rise above stuck and become unstuck. Let me tell you one more story. In Daniel chapter 1, there is a story of a young man. He's somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. How many of you have heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den? You heard that story before? So Daniel is this young man minding his own business in his hometown of Jerusalem. And one day, this mighty army rolls into town and just sacks the community. And they go and they find good-looking, strong young men, and they kidnap them. They take them captive, they abduct them, they take them to Babylon. And in Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar starts to say things like, hey, bring me the smartest, the best looking, the strongest, the fittest. I'm going to train them up in the way of God, in the way of Babylon. And so this is what happens. You see this in Daniel chapter 1, verse 4. You see this story. And look at the very last sentence there. He says, he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Here's the point. The Babylonians took these little Hebrew young men, and the point was to drive all of the Hebrew out of them, to drive all of the things that they had known before out of them, and to make them completely holy Babylonian. It's to squeeze out the way of God in their life and to make them worship the culture and the circumstances around them, just like the world tries to do to you today. It's in the midst of this pressure that Daniel rises up, and in verse 8 says this, ain't no way. I'm not doing that. And he says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in any way. You know what he's saying? They came and said, we're going to give you choicest food. We're going to give you the best wine. We're going to give you all of these things, and you're going to eat like one of us. And Daniel said, nope, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be like one of you. Now, stop and think about that for a minute. You have to have a real picture of who you want to be if you're able to say, nope, I don't want to be like that. Daniel had a vision for what God had for his life, just like you need to have a vision of how you're going to stand up under pressure, how you're going to fight through when adversity strikes. Daniel said, this is who I am. This is who I'm meant to be. I won't defile myself like that. You may have to put me in your clothes. I may have to live in your city 900 miles away from home. You may give me a different name, but I am not going to become a Babylonian. So here's the deal. He doesn't. He says, test me for 10 days and see if I don't perform better than everybody else, if I'm not more fit, if I'm not smarter. The official says, okay, for 10 days, but if it doesn't work, it's my way. For 10 days, Daniel's the best. And so they're allowed to go about doing things their own way, not getting stuck in the culture. At the end of the process, do you know what happens? Daniel's brought in for the final test. His friends are brought in for the final test, and they are found to be 10 times smarter, 10 times better than anybody else around them, because they weren't willing to fall into the cycle of being stuck. They were willing to live differently, is what I believe. Fasting is not about getting what we want, but it's about getting what God wants. And this is exactly what Daniel did. He wanted what God wanted. And he ultimately set up the return to Jerusalem. Now, there's this verse that I think is really important in verse 9. Can you put that up there? So Daniel is going about this fast. And so it would be really easy for me this morning to make Daniel the hero of the story. But he's not. God's the hero of the story. It says this in verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Now God. I'm going to be honest. Fasting isn't about you at all. Giving up something isn't about you at all. It's about wanting what God has for you more than what you see in temporary satisfaction, in temporary fulfillment. It's saying, God, I know there is something more out there. Traction comes from this focused attention. Now, I want to ask you one question, and then we're going to close. Put your wildest dreams out on the table. Right now, just put them out there on the table. What are my wildest dreams? And then, where am I stuck? Where am I stuck? What's keeping me from getting there? And then answer this question, just to yourself. What does God have for me on the other side of the fast? I want to be honest for a second. I believe that God has more for you than you know. More for you than you think this world can offer. More for you than a wonderful education has. Than a great season of football. Than a national championship. Better than a baby. Better than the best job in the world and the most money. God has something far better than that. Amen. And I think if you would just pursue him with a focused intensity, that he will take your dreams and your aspirations and he will use them for so much more. I don't know if any of you are watching the news, but I can tell you as I watch the news, this is not the ideal world I want to live in. The hatred that guides people today, the division and the animosity, it drives me insane because it's not God's best. And I think God's calling a generation to make a difference, to make a change. I think it could start here. I think and I believe that if you had focused intensity to pursue the things of God, he could use you to be the next Martin Luther King, the next